As we move forward looking at the history of the sacrament of baptism, it's important to focus on St. Augustine. St. Augustine had a profound influence on the theology of baptism in the church, particularly the West going forward. And Augustine's theology that largely influenced the West came out of some various controversies that he had. So first we can talk about Augustine's interactions with the Pelagians. Now, one of the aspects, if you'll remember, about Pelagianism is that it really downplayed the effects of original sin. For Pelagius, the followers of Pelagius, original sin was passed down by imitation and not by propagation. So it really reduced original sin to bad example. And so that would really minimize, say, the effect that original sin has on, well, a newborn infant. So Augustine criticizes the Pelagians for not holding to the necessity of baptizing infants. Now, you'll recall that in North Africa, not long prior to Augustine, you have St. Cyprian of Carthage talking about how infant baptism was of apostolic origin. And so Augustine is inheriting that theology and is now in his controversies with the Pelagians, giving it a new and firmer theological basis. Augustine argues that infants need baptism because they're subjects of original sin, and not original sin merely as something, this imitation of bad example, but as a reality contracted at conception, something we are born with. Baptism takes away original sin, and for Augustine, left in original sin, infants who die cannot see the face of God. Augustine's very pessimistic in this sense, in the possibility of salvation for those who die without baptism. When it comes to, well, how can this be a true baptism because infants can't make an act of faith, Augustine appeals to the faith of the parents and the sponsors to explain how the baptism of an infant is a true baptism, one that includes faith. We're going to see that this notion of baptism forgiving original sin, which is a necessity for salvation, will affect both the theology and the practice of baptism moving forward in Catholic theology. You couldn't have this stress on the necessity of baptism for salvation, at least in this way, until you had a worked out theology of original sin, which really comes with Augustine, and it comes with Augustine really because of his interactions with the Pelagians. Augustine also, later in his life, dealt with the Donatists. Now, Donatism was an indirect outcome of one of the persecutions, the Diocletian's persecutions. At the time of those persecutions, some Christians were required to hand over their scriptures as a sign of a repudiation of their faith. When those persecutions came to an end, those who had done so were branded traditores, those who had handed over, right? You have handed over the scriptures. You look at that in English, you go traitor, right? Traitor. Traditores, one who handed over the scriptures, to betrayed the faith in that way. Well, coming out of that, the Donatists were, in response, rigorists, holding that the church must be a church of saints and not sinners. And of course, they were the saints, right? And that sacraments such as baptism administered by traditores were invalid. And this is something we've already seen a little bit in the rebaptism controversies. But again, Augustine's going to develop a theology for why we don't rebaptize those who were baptized by the traditores, or why those baptisms are valid in the first place. So why is it that a sinful minister can perform a valid sacrament? That's the question here. The Donatists said, no, the valid sacrament can only follow upon the holiness of the minister, and Augustine's going to react to that. Well, anyway, as the history goes here, around 311, a new bishop of Carthage, Sicilian, was consecrated by someone who had allegedly been a traditor. So here's Bishop A is in the line of one of these traditores. His opponents consecrated a short-lived rival who was succeeded by Donatus, after whom the schism was named. So here's Bishop A in line with those that handed over the scriptures. And now we have Bishop B, who's in line with Donatus. Notice this also brings up the question of the validity of ordination, right? It's can you have a valid succession from someone who is one who turned over the scriptures? Well, the Donatists viewed themselves and not the other Christians as the true church, the only one with therefore valid sacraments. Now you'll remember this isn't a completely novel idea at the time. This is a commonplace in North Africa. Remember the rebaptism controversies where there is no baptism outside of the true church, right? And so Saint Stephen in Rome had to respond to that. Well, Augustine, his view was that it was the office of the priest, not the personal holiness of the minister, which gave validity to the celebration of the sacraments. It's truly Christ who baptizes through the human minister. Now, this is important for a few reasons. One, this will develop in the Middle Ages into the idea that the sacraments are effected ex opere operato, by the very carrying out of the sacramental work, by the positing of matter and form by the proper minister with the proper intention, is how some of the medievals will explain that. And therefore, the validity of the sacrament depends on those things, not on the holiness of the minister. So this is a development we're not going to trace. We would trace this in a general sacramental theology class. But you can see here the roots are with the question of baptism and to a certain degree also ordination. What do we do with these apparently sinful ministers? Are their sacraments valid? The church will respond with the language of the sacraments affecting their results ex opere operato. Also, this is good news for us because it does mean, if Augustine's right, which the tradition says he is, if Augustine's right, we don't have to worry if our priest is a scoundrel. We don't have to wonder if our sins are forgiven in the confessional. We don't have to question whether or not we are receiving the true body and blood of Christ based on the hidden life of the minister. There's a certain objective guarantee of the sacraments amidst the subjective failings of the ministers. Well, another element that's developed here as Augustine's talking about this is going to be the baptismal character. So Augustine, in his De Baptismo contra Donatistas, on baptism against the Donatists, he develops the notion of the baptismal character. Again, this is an idea you would develop more in a class on general sacramentology. This is the idea that baptism, confirmation, and holy orders, in addition to producing the sacramental grace, also produce this sometimes called indelible mark or sacramental character. And this stems from the theology of this stems from Augustine's controversy with the Donatists. Because how is it, Augustine asked, that the Donatists' baptisms were valid, but they did not produce the grace one would receive within the church? Right? If the sacraments were only two elements, if they were only the sign and the resulting grace, it would seem that we have the sign with the Donatists, but we don't have the resulting grace. So how can we say the sacrament is valid? Well, Augustine's going to posit this third reality, the sacramental character. The answer was that the heretical baptism gave the sacramental character. It has a valid effect. Well, it did not communicate the grace of the sacrament, the so-called res sacramenti, the reality of the sacrament, the final reality of the sacrament. Hence, the heretical baptism is of no avail as long as the person remains outside of the church. However, if the person repents and returns to the church, he's not therefore rebaptized. So you can imagine one who receives the sacrament of baptism with a certain amount of insincerity, right? They don't put up a roadblock necessarily, but a certain amount of immaturity, of of insincerity, um, does the sacramental grace flow completely? We'd say, well, most likely not. It's in virtue of the sacramental character, however, that grace may later be more fully affected once the obstacle is removed. So here we have Augustine bringing a theology that, again, is incorporated into the tradition. You'll see it maintained by the scholastics, and even today, that with 3 sacraments that are not repeated, baptism, confirmation, and holy orders, there's this tertium quid, this third thing, the sacramental character. Well, after Augustine, there's a move, shifting in sacramental theology when it comes to baptism. By 600 AD, the Western churches began to see a change in the baptismal process. First of all, more and more children being baptized. This became the norm, and sometimes the exclusive norm, of infant baptisms. We'll talk about this now. We'll also talk about it again when we talk about confirmation, because this is a reality that affects the separation of baptism from the sacrament of confirmation as 2 very distinct sacraments. Why more and more children being baptized? Well, it stems partially from the teaching of St. Augustine on original sin. We'll have a chance to look at this and how that develops. But this makes sense. If baptism is required for removing original sin, and original sin is a barrier to eternal life, then one should get an infant baptized, because infants are in danger of dying, and we want them saved. So this is a natural development once Augustine's theology of original sin is accepted. Another reason we see more and more infant baptisms after a few centuries is culture was thoroughly Christianized, right? We weren't going out and preaching to more adults for the most part. There was little issue of choosing to be Christian as there was in the earlier centuries of the church when we were preaching to pagans. So baptism becomes separated from the Eucharist and emphasizes more and more the removal of original sin. This is a shift in understanding of what baptism is directed to. In those earliest documents we saw, baptism was directly linked to reception of the Eucharist. They were of one ceremony, there was one understanding. The baptism led directly to participation in the Eucharist. Now that direct link is severed, and the direct link becomes baptism removes original sin. The baptismal ritual becomes more passive for the recipient because they are infants. So even if that triple interrogation remains, you're asking an infant and the sponsor or the godparent responds. So even in the case of adults, the norm is infants, and so the adult baptism becomes more and more passive. And the catechumenate loses much of its significance because we don't need a catechumenate. The catechumenate will eventually in the Middle Ages just slowly disappear. Such that prior to the 1980s, like when my father came into the Catholic Church for a brief time, what was it? It was go meet with the priest a few times. So we'll have a chance to look later in the class at the renewal of the catechumenate. All right, we'll stop there with Augustine, and we'll look in the next video at some of the general trends in the Middle Ages that resulted from these points of departure.